Welcome to 12 days through the book of 2 Chronicles. I'm going to read to you the first, I think it's 6 verses of chapter 1. So these are the opening words of 2 Chronicles. Obviously, the book picks up from the meticulous detail that the chronicler, probably Ezra, has taken to describe to us the preparation for the building of the temple and the reign of David, how the kingdom itself became a kingdom. Now, Solomon, the son of David, takes over the throne from his father, and here are the opening words. Now, Solomon, the son of David, was strengthened in his kingdom, and the Lord his God was with him and exalted him exceedingly. And Solomon spoke to all Israel, to the captains of thousands and of hundreds, to the judges, and to every leader in all Israel, the heads of the fathers' houses. Then Solomon and all the assembly with him went to the high place that was at Gibeon, for the tabernacle of meeting with God was there, which Moses the servant of the Lord had made in the wilderness. But David had brought up the ark of God from Kirjath-jearim to the place David had prepared for it, for he pitched a tent for it at Jerusalem. Now the bronze altar that Bezalel the son of Uri the son of Hur had made, he put before the tabernacle of the Lord. Solomon and the assembly sought him there. And Solomon went up there to the bronze altar before the Lord, which was at the tabernacle of meeting, and offered 1,000 burnt offerings on it. This is a fascinating insight into the character and personality type of these two men, David and his son Solomon. As we've just read, what David had done was he had left the tabernacle of meeting, which had been made by Moses, which was the place where the ark was meant to be kept. He had left the tabernacle and all of the furnishings, the altar, the bronze laver, the lampstand, the altar for burnt incense where the showbread was put on every morning, all the stuff there, the curtains, all that stuff. He'd left it in Gibeon, but he had brought the ark of God, which had been taken by the Philistines and then moved around, and eventually it ended up in the house of this guy Obed-Edom. He'd brought it from Obed-Edom's house into Jerusalem with him. He didn't take it back to the tabernacle at Gibeon. He brought it into Jerusalem with him. Now, I want us to think about that, because that is technically not the right thing to do. He should have taken it back to the tabernacle and put it where it was supposed to be, but he didn't. He brought it into Jerusalem with him, and he pitched a tent for it himself. He was still treating it with respect. But he was just so desperate for the presence of God in his kingdom, in his capital city. And what I want to take from this, so then when Solomon becomes king, the very first thing he does is he gathers every leader in all of Israel, and he brings them together, and he says, we are going to go up to the tabernacle at Gibeon. Now, the ark wasn't there anymore. It was in Jerusalem, but they went up to Gibeon, and there they performed sacrifices and worshipped God in the prescribed manner in a far more obedient way than David had done. They went to the tabernacle and they used the altar, which was supposed to be the only place sacrifices were to be made. And so Solomon was far more meticulous in his treatment of the tabernacle and of the ordinances of the church, of how the church of his day, Israel, was meant to worship God. And what I want to do with that contrast is I want us to think about two different types of leader that we do encounter in the church today. There may be other types, but I'm going to talk about these two. The one is the type of leader who is like David. He is a man of the Spirit. I mean, David was a prophet. He was anointed with the Spirit of God. He wrote more than half the Psalms. Even though he was not meticulous about all of the little details of how it was meant to be done, his heart was a heart for God, and God accepted him. And in fact, for the rest of the book of 1st, 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, God is repeatedly saying, when there's a good king saying, Hezekiah loved the Lord as his father David had done. I mean, David is just a wonderful figure in the sight of God. God accepts him, even though he wasn't meticulous. In fact, David was the kind of the guy that at one point got down to the tabernacle. He's running away from Saul. He's hungry, and he takes the showbread and he eats it. You're not supposed to eat the showbread. But I mean, that's who he was. He was a man of war. He was a man whose gift and call was to make space for the church, make space for the kingdom of God's people. He was a man who was not bogged down with detail. He was a man who was slaughtering the enemy, conquering, bringing peace, making space, and loving God with all his heart. And, leave the details up to someone else. And you know what? God accepted him and God used him. God will use men like that. Now, I'm telling you, there are leaders like that in the church. And they frustrate people in the church who are more meticulous about how worship should be conducted. They're more meticulous about theology. Often these guys have got kind of weak theology or just kind of don't really care about theology, man. They just want us to love God and speak prophetically, and they lead people into the presence of God, and they kind of shoot from the hip, and they will defend the church when there's someone attacking it. But they're not like Solomon. They're not men who really have a very deep and meticulous understanding of all the ordinances in Scripture, because Solomon was wiser than his father David. And as soon as Solomon took over, he noticed this deviation from what God had commanded. No, we are meant to go up to the tabernacle and make sacrifices there. And here, as an analogy, let me put it this way. The church needs more than the ark. Now there are leaders who that's their gift. That's the grace on their lives. They're not so good about the altar, which was in Gibeon, but they're brilliant with the ark, the presence of God, and a heart that just runs after God and nothing else. But the church needs more than that. The church doesn't only need the ark, it needs the altar. It needs theology. It needs structures, and it does need leaders who will be meticulous about how churches are meant to function, how they're meant to grow, how eldership teams are meant to work. But some leaders just do not care for that sort of thing. I mean, they care for it, but it's just like, it's not the thing that drives them. They're never going to give it attention. But there are other leaders who are perhaps far more meticulous about the things of theology and of structure and of how worship is to function and of how the liturgy of a service is meant to be conducted and of how leadership teams are meant to operate and all the other stuff that comes along with building a church. And yet, when you compare these two men, David and Solomon, which was the one who ran the race and kept the faith until the end of his life? And which was the one who backslid into idolatry? It was the one who was all meticulous about, well, we can't just have the ark, we've got to have the altar, we've got to go up to Gibeon, we've got to tick all the boxes and do it right, which was good and acceptable to God. And yet, it was him that backslid. And it was David, the one who would eat the showbread and just kind of carry on as if like none of the stuff was important. Actually, it was him, the one who had the heart after God, who served God acceptably all his life. And so I guess at the end of the day, all I want to say is this: the church needs both kind of leaders. And so if you're a minister and you're kind of a David in character, I want to encourage you to be at rest that God may choose a man who is more meticulous than you theologically to take over the leadership of the church from you, who will settle the church into more maturity than you could have. The church can't just have the ark, it's got to have the altar. And you know what? That's okay if God chooses to do that. But if you're a minister who's more like Solomon, meticulous in theology and structure and order and that sort of thing, a man who has the ability to see the church settled in maturity. What a wonderful gift you are. But I want you to be aware, my friend, that all your understanding of theology and how the church can be structured and taught and matured, all of that will not secure you from making shipwreck of your own life, as Solomon did, because the church can't just have the altar. It's got to have the ark. It's got to have men who love the ark, the presence of God.